When you hear gamers talk about great games today, the gameplay seems to be the least on their minds. It's as if the gameplay doesn't matter to most gamers today. It's as if they really don't even want a game, which to me is fine. Some people play games for different reasons. Some people play games to look at the visuals. Some play for interesting stories that they can't get in shows and movies. Some play for gameplay. Some play for all reasons. And some just play because it's something to pass the time or something their friends do. And all these reasons why people play games is perfectly fine. But today we're going to talk about the stories in games. Because see, I have a slight issue with this push of stories in games. And let me be clear before we continue on. I'm not saying that games can't have stories or they shouldn't have stories. I'm going to break down my real reason why I don't particularly care for the way they're handling stories in games today. Because you see, it's not the fact that they have stories. Games have had stories for years now. But the way they're doing it today tells me that these developers and studios don't want to make games. They want to make movies. And that's fine, I suppose. But I feel that they should do better at telling the audience that so that people know what to buy and what not to buy. From games like Uncharted, Life is Strange, God of War, and the list goes on, I played plenty of games that had good stories. I played plenty of games where I enjoyed the story. But see, the issue is that what I call these story gamers, they hype up games solely based upon the story. Perfectly fine. That's your opinion. The issue I have is I'm learning that these people really don't know anything about the story in the game they're experiencing. They don't know anything about what they're talking about. And this isn't a subjective thing. This is actually me playing a game, paying attention to the plot, and then hearing someone else hype up the plot, which is fine. They can feel this hype. But when they talk about it, it's like, well, that didn't happen in the story. That didn't go on. Your interpretation of the story literally didn't happen. So I'm confused on why everyone's doing this. Now, my opinion on why this happens is mainly just due to gamer hype. People hype up stories in games more than they do gameplay. Look at the new God of War. God of War initially was supposed to be the Devil May Cry killer or competition. And I'll admit that God of War does a good job of competing with Devil May Cry back in the 6th generation. But God of War out of nowhere became this story heavy game about father and son, which is fine. New direction is fine and all, but the issue is that God of War 2018 is supposed to be a sequel or continuation of the previous God of Wars. So let me break down, just using God of War alone, my issues with these story-based gamers. People will sit there and praise God of War 2018. Look, the game is cool, I like it, but the story doesn't make too much of any sense. And we can start with the big elephant in the room is, how in the world is Kratos even in Norse mythology? The game never explains it, the writers never explain it, and I don't know about you, I call that bad writing. At the end of God of War 3, spoiler alert, the world pretty much ended. Kratos killed all the gods, the world is flooding, everyone's dying, and everything seems to be ending. Yes, it's hinted that Kratos survived, but survived to what? We do not know how Kratos got where he is. They don't explain it. We're supposed to go along with it. And sure, let's just say I ignore that. But I'm supposed to care about the story in every other God of War, which I played and enjoyed those other games as games and stories. But now all of a sudden I'm supposed to ignore this big elephant in the room? Again, when I ask people who care about the story and lore of God of War about this, they don't seem to care that this big issue doesn't make any sense if you care so much about the story. This is what I mean by people hyping up stories in games. You cannot tell me with a straight face you care about a plot in a game when they ultimately make the plot make no sense. I could touch on many things with God of War, but another thing I'll touch on before I move on to another game is this big push that Kratos was just some evil monster that killed everybody in the previous God of Wars, and he was some selfish bastard that hated everybody and everything, and he had no soul, and he was just this evil demon. And some of that may be true if you didn't play the other games, which I'm realizing so many didn't or didn't pay attention to the other game stories. They've showed Kratos' humanity plenty of times. Matter of fact, in the first God of War, do people not forget that Kratos' whole mission was to lose his memories of killing his own family because he was dealing with guilt and depression? So much so that even after completing his goal, learning that he could not get past the guilt that he decided to commit suicide. Very heavy topics here. And for some reason, people act like none of that happened. Apparently, God of War just been kill, murder, and it was none of this other stuff going on. Now, I can see how you might have picked up on that or felt that way if you didn't pay attention to the story, which let me help you out here. Back in that time, people really didn't pay attention to stories. So it's a big chance that people either just didn't play those games or they played them and didn't care about the plot, because that's how a lot of gamers were back then. They didn't care. You know what I mean? People play Grand Theft Auto and praise those games and beat them multiple times and don't know what happened in the story. Happens all the time, including with games like God of War. But all of a sudden, in the 8th generation, gaming became story time. So now everyone's hyping up story. So let's go to another game heavy on the story that I know no one pays attention to. Uncharted. Now, I could pick at a lot of the Sony games here, but let's just stick with Uncharted. I played all the Uncharted, even the one on the PS Vita. They all were pretty good games, but Uncharted 4 to me wasn't that great. It was too much of a movie, and the parts that I did like, which was the gameplay, they wanted to bombard me with a stupid story that made no sense at all if you paid attention to the other games. And guess what? How did that story not make any sense? Anytime I've ever talked to someone who claims to love Uncharted and have it tattooed on their back, I asked them, why does Drake have a brother, despite the fact in Uncharted 3, they said he didn't have a brother? Matter of fact, they explained he had no family. There's a character in Uncharted 3 named Marlo. That's the main villain. She ran down Drake's family history. And a lot of that was repeated in Uncharted 4. But you know what she never mentioned? That Drake had a brother. Because he didn't have a brother initially. Matter of fact, you can learn this if you go dig deep online and find the original concept from Uncharted 4. He never had a brother. They just made him have one for whatever reason. Maybe because they wanted to repeat what they did with games like Last of Us of having a dual companionship. And keep in mind that Uncharted 4 was written and mostly created by the guy who did Last of Us, which is not the original people who worked on the Uncharted series. So we're already dealing with a different writer here with his own agenda that he wants to push for the franchise. And that's why we got this mess of a story. And yes, condensed to its own thing, is the story good? No, it's not. Not to me. It's just okay. It's not that good of a story compared to the other Uncharted. And I'm not saying the other ones were Shakespeare, but the Uncharted 4 story, even if I ignore the fact he didn't have a brother because they said he didn't have a brother in the third game, and this game is in the same universe as the third game, so you can't say it's a different version of Drake. Even if I ignore all that, it doesn't make any sense. Now, I know a lot of people are going to hear me rant about this stuff and say they don't care. And that's fine. You have the right to not care. But then, to me, just to me, little old me, random guy on the internet, you can't say you care about stories in games. You can't say you care about the plot in games and how they changed your life so much if the plot doesn't make sense. And this is not subjective. You cannot argue how 1 minute a character doesn't have a brother at all, and then the next minute he does. And unless he's some long lost, never known of brother, possible. But to say that Drake always knew he had a brother, but then for the villain of Uncharted 3 to announce his family history and never mention he had a brother, which is weird because why wouldn't she be able to do that when she announced Drake's mother, what happened to his mother and his father, he was in an orphanage, all that other stuff came back up in Uncharted 4. But somehow not knowing he had a brother is a thing. Doesn't make sense. Game stories not connecting to the other games in the series is just a piece of the issue for me. Another thing is how the story in games are ruining gameplay for a lot of games. Again, going back to God of War, they wanted to tell this daddy daycare story in God of War, which I'ma just be real, I didn't care about. I'm not saying it's bad, just didn't care. But the gameplay suffered. Sure, the new camera angle, the new axe, and all that stuff is cool, but now Kratos has less moves, the gameplay is less complex. And honestly, I can't even fathom why they would do that. It's no reason to take away the gameplay or make the gameplay watered down to tell this story. You don't have to do that. You could keep both. But I know why they did that is because they wanted to tell the story. That's really just what they wanted. If you paid attention to God of War's development, this story is pretty much just Cory Barlog, or I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. I think it's Barlog. Cory Barlog's story. This is his story of what he was going through in his life while creating the game that he put into Kratos, which is, to me, bad writing. Yes, I know someone's going to say, how is that bad writing? Let me explain. Because you can do that with a new character. You can even possibly do that with a character that fits your life story. For example, take Neil Druckmann. Neil Druckmann made Last of Us. Last of Us is a new IP. So he took a lot of stuff going on in his life and put in Last of Us. You can do that because, well, there's nothing to reference. You can't take Cory Barlog's life, put it on Kratos, and it just magically makes sense. It doesn't. And because that was the focus of the game, which is to tell this story, the gameplay suffered. It didn't seem like they wanted to make an action game like God of War has always been. But they still told you this is the same old God of War, just with a different interpretation of action. Fine. But this is a watered down, easy version of action. Matter of fact, it's not even just watered down easy. You didn't even take the time to make sure that your hardest difficulty mode is balanced. And the fact that you didn't give us any achievements or trophies, rather, to go with the hardest difficulty tells me everything I need to know. This is the first God of War that I know of that has a story mode where you pretty much don't have to play the game. And an action game. An action game is promoting you don't have to play it. Again, I don't care about story games. I love Life is Strange. I love Wolf Among Us. I love those games. I love point and click games like The Day of the Tentacle. So I'm not unfamiliar with those styles of games and I'm not against them. But you can't do both or claim you're doing both and not do them. Because if you do that, then I'm going to scratch my head and say, well, I bought this to play an action game. But what I got was story time. If I wanted story time, I would have bought a story time game. Do you see my issue here? Now, for some of you, you may say, well, man, this isn't really a big deal. Just don't buy these games. And you're right, I won't. But it's hard to not buy them when they're telling you this is what you're getting. You're going to get both a story and a game. And let me tell you an example of just that. Go play a Rockstar game. Red Dead Redemption 2 has one of the best stories in the game that I've experienced. Sure, there's some parts that are kind of silly, but it's a great, engaging story. And the gameplay, to me, I know a lot of people didn't like the way the game felt, but to me, the gameplay was great and lots of things to do. Typical Rockstar fashion. They gave me both a story and a game. It would be really weird if all of a sudden Rockstar says, we're going to give you a story and a game, and then I turn it on and it's just the story, or even just the game. Where's my story? And if you don't believe me, because some people who know me think I just hate story in games, no. Take Metal Gear. Metal Gear is another franchise where, let's admit, Metal Gear stories are silly. But I do like the stories in Metal Gear. I like listening and trying to figure out Kojima's weird interpretation of modern day society or military life or whatever he feels like talking about. But when Kojima made Metal Gear Solid 5, and if you played that, to me, that's one of the best stealth action games we've had in years. But then you look around and say, well, where's the doggone plot? Now, if you know the history of that game, you know that game was in development hell. You know a lot of money was going different ways. So the story never got completed. But the thing I can say is that at least I got a game. So there's that. But you take something like Death Stranding. Now, remember the issue with Death Stranding? I know a lot of people try to come back and praise that. But a lot of people's issue with Death Stranding was the initial advertisement was, well, we were going to get some type of Metal Gear-esque, action-esque game, and you really just got a story with walking. Now, once you're aware that that's what it is, then it's fine. Then you can make the decision to say, do I want this walking game or not? With a story, or am I not in the mood for that? See, it's the false advertisement or the mixture of advertisement that confuses me. And that's the part I really don't like. You want to make a story game? Go ahead, knock yourself out. Because I believe if the developer and the creators make something they truly want to make, I trust they'll do a good job at it. But don't sit here and tell me, the customer, that you're going to give me both things, or you're going to give me one thing and you really don't give me but one thing. You give me something totally different. Now, to end this long rant, I have to repeat this just one more time because I have a strong feeling people are going to come over and say, man, you just hate stories and games, man. You just don't like them. Again, I like stories and games. Stories and games can stay. I have no issue with them. My main issue with stories and games is this. If you want to make a story game, do that. If you want to make a game that's balanced, focusing both on story and gameplay, do that. I can name you plenty of games that had great stories and great gameplay. For example, Dragon Quest Builders 2. I love the story in the game, and the gameplay was just as important as the story was. Games like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Red Dead Redemption 2, BioShock, Prey. I can keep naming so many games that do both, and that was intentional to do both. But for some reason, when I get hit with this bombardment of games that tell me they're doing both, but really they're just doing one, and if I'm being honest, the one thing they decide to focus on ain't all that hot to begin with, now I'm the bad guy because I'm like, well, you told me I was getting an action game and a story. And really what I just got was sprinkles of action game, and that part wasn't even all that hot. And then I got this majority abundance of story that was mediocre, and 9 times out of 10, if it was connected to a sequel or something, it don't make sense in the context of the universe that it's in. So it's really just dumb. So that's my main issue. But I hope you guys understand. If you guys feel similar to me, or if you don't, let me know in the comment section. Like, comment, and subscribe if you can. All that stuff helps the channel grow. If you want more game and opinion pieces like this, like I said, hit that like button. Let me know what you think in the comments. Peace. I'm out. And again, I don't dislike story games. Do you hear me? I just want them to be honest. Peace out.